It is often said that road to hell is paved with good intentions, and the events that transpired here in Cuba during the 50s are no different.
You probably heard of the communist revolution that occurred in Cuba during the 1950s, which put Fidel Castro and his administration into power. However, to understand why the knots of history unwounded this way, we have to look at the political and economical state of Cuba prior to the revolution, as these are the leading factors in almost every social upheaval. In part, Cuba's one-crop economy, sugarcane, was the reason for its struggles, and when you consider that almost 90% of that raw sugar prior to the revolution went into the USA, it is impossible to doubt that the US hadn't had a full control over the Cuban economy. And even with that, it wasn't just sugar US companies controlled in Cuba. They had their hands in everything from telephone and electrical services to railways and even control of 80% of the arable land. With so much American money invested in Cuba, it makes only sense that the politics of Cuba were in control of the US as well. This political control came from the American involvement in the Cuban Independence War, known today as the Spanish-American War. After it, Cuba was technically free, but USA made sure they could control Cuba through a deeply corrupt government which could be easily swayed with money. Hence, as long as US companies were allowed to continue with their monopolistic control of Cuban economy, the government officials and political higher class with close ties to the USA got richer and richer. So much so that the income per capita in Cuba rose to be the 5th highest in the Americas, all the while the income inequality and economic growth were one of the worst in the Americas. 40% of Cubans were either highly underemployed or unemployed. Many of them didn't know how to read and had no access to clean water. It was a very tough time for an average Cuban to live in, and it was this world that Fidel was born into and grew up in. However, Fidel didn't have to deal with most of the struggles of an average Cuban at the time. He was born to one of the few wealthier sugarcane farmers, profiting off of the unequal trade with the US. Nonetheless, Castro wasn't a good child or a student, and therefore was sent a lot between different schools around Cuba, during which he came into contact with the average Cuban, struggling to make ends meet. Eventually, Castro got into the University of Havana and studied law, but he wasn't a good student and it didn't seem like he wanted to be. He spent most of his time trying to get involved first in university politics and then in the country's politics. He got involved with the Orthodox Party and passionately spoke about anti-imperialism, rampant corruption, and the distasteful US control over the entire country. Castro wasn't a communist. Not yet. He just wanted to see change. With that change never really coming and the political situation even starting to get worse, first with gangs and violent clashes in the street and then with the violent coup of Fulgencio Batista, Cuba wasn't improving. It was getting worse. It was due to all these events that Castro's thinking became ever more radical, finding answers in the far leftist ideals of Marxism and Leninism. He started to believe that almost all Cuba's problems came from the class struggle, and the only hope left to get rid of it was to world the revolution. With now both parties getting more violent, people had to start choosing a side, whether it be the well-known corrupt and brutal government of Batista or the far-left proletariat favoring Castro. Weighing the choices, many Cuban people and establishments started to favor Castro. Newspapers like Prensa Libre or the Bohemian, the most highly regarded Latin American newspaper at the time, were all supporting Castro and his fight against the Cuban dictator. Everyone hoping that Castro will bring on the necessary change that hasn't really happened ever since the Spanish-American War. So when Castro finally managed to come to power, the whole country waited for that change. And at first it may have seemed like it will come to fruition. Castro seized American companies' assets in Cuba and started what he saw as improvement of the country. Land redistribution, universal education / healthcare, along with vaccination, harsh crackdown on gangs and racism, etc. However, all these improvements came at a huge cost. Mass executions without trials were held, forced labor camps were established, freedom of travel was massively restricted, and the freedom of speech became almost non-existent. The establishments and newspapers that supported Castro at the start now suddenly realized they made a huge mistake, and many of them tried fighting back to no avail. Thousands of people were killed, exiled, and even more escaped. Castro had full control over the government and could seemingly do whatever he thought was the best for the people. But the idea of fighting a people's revolution to only then decide that you alone know what the people want seems very hypocritical. Nonetheless, despite the suffering and thousands of lost profits, day-to-day life improved for an average Cuban. However, with the biggest economy in the world now hating you and your largest ally being across the globe, communism, even though beneficial for the average Cuban in the short term, would most definitely prove to be a terrible choice in the long term. The Cuban people now realize they supported a dictator and a system that will, putting it lightly, overstay its welcome, and still is. In the last free publication of the Bohemian newspaper, it stated, "In making our own revolution, it is not necessary to subject our people to the oppression and vassalage of Russia. To make a profound social revolution, it is not necessary to implant a system which degrades people to the lowly levels of state serfdom, to wipe out the last vestige of freedom and dignity. This is not a genuine revolution." So let that serve as a reminder that no matter how better the ideas of true communism may seem from your current standpoint, in the end, it is always a system that degrades people to the lowly levels of state serfdom. Hello everyone, this was a very different video compared to what I usually do on this channel, so if you didn't like it, feel free to hit that dislike button, but if you liked it, let me know down in the comments if you want to see more videos like these or that. Thank you, until next time, my name is Laser.